This time on Watchers of Tomorrow, the Sci-Fi Inquisition!
Hello, welcome to Watchers of Tomorrow, the sci-fi review and critique show that is currently having an identity crisis. My name is Gep, and I'm joined as always by my friend and co-host Dr. Izix.
Hi!
And we're doing a different thing this week because it is our 200th episode. We wanted to do something special, and I'm going to try to get through this really fast because I actually have a lot of people waiting in the wings. So I'm going to do some quick introductions because today we're having a roundtable discussion on the general idea of what in the world is science fiction, even in the first place, because we keep having these discussions between ourselves about whether or not a movie we're going to cover actually counts.
Mm-hmm.
So we have with us in no particular order Amanda Hoots,
hey,
from the YouTube channel Hoots and the podcast Respect the Dead, where I understand you usually don't.
Yes, we usually don't. Very occasionally we actually do, but
It is glorious.
We also have a game designer and writer and interactive artist who also teaches, is probably like one of the most actually successful people we've had on generally. Sharang Biswas, who you can find on Blue Sky mostly as Sharang Biswas at Blue Sky. I'm not sure how to read Blue Sky things. Anyway, hello Sharang.
Hey, I'm making an embarrassed face that you cannot see.
Hooray, podcasting.
Izix can imagine it because he's seen me make embarrassed faces.
Yes.
And finally, we have a purveyor of video game videos, history videos, and video game history videos. Rosencreutz, who you can find on the YouTube channel, Rosencreutz with 3 Z's.
Yeah, the Z's weren't intentional. I just kind of got, apparently there's some random Russian EDM DJ who took the name originally, so I had to go for it.
Also on Blue Sky, because everyone's on Blue Sky now, because every other social media company is terrible, and I'm the only one who uses Tumblr.
I thought you were going to say Threads somehow. I was like, oh no.
That's part of the terrible, so.
I was thinking you're going to name some random forum, that's been up since the early 90s or something.
I just hang out in the mud.
Yeah, who's still on Friendster? We're going to jump in the general discussion in a minute because I want to make sure that we don't keep everyone waiting. I wanted to start. I've been looking up author definitions and things all week. Mm-hmm. And I found the perfect quote that I think we can start off with before I directly assault someone for their opinions. In the introductory essay that Isaac Asimov wrote for the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction in 1978, he gave what I think is the best introduction to our little thing here. I suppose it is a measure of the richness of the field of science fiction that no two of its practitioners are liable to agree even on something as fundamental as its definition. So that's kind of what we're doing.
Yeah.
So just to jump in, I wanted to start with Rosencreutz because a little bit ago we were doing a weird fun episode where we asked a bunch of people to send in just random things they thought of about science fiction. And Rosencreutz said in this interesting thing about how he doesn't know if Dune, which is one of the fundamental pillars of science fiction and redefined the entire genre, should actually count. And that sort of inspired me to put this whole thing together, if I'm being honest. So I thought we could at least start with you as a jumping off point.
Yep. It's one of those things I've always liked to poke at just because on some level it's very obviously science fiction and there's always some sort of grounded explanation for all the things that if you didn't really pay full attention to it or just jumped in medias res or didn't read all the things very carefully, you'd think were fantastical, magical. I mean, it's about ostensibly fulfilling a prophecy. There's future sight, all these different things, but every little bit of it tries to have a background explanation in that way that we kind of, I guess, describe as hard sci-fi would be something that tends to have a groundedness to it. Mm-hmm. Although when I was thinking about it today, because I reread the rant that I sent in, and it almost feels like instead of saying that it's science fiction, that it's more like an anthropology fiction or sociology fiction specifically, because it's so fixated on making up the explanation of this culture in the book.
Indeed.
Which I think is part of the interesting thing, because like you were saying, And I think this gets into where I started thinking about it definitionally. Firstly, how familiar is everybody else with Dune as a franchise?
Yeah. I've read the first book. Actually, Isaac knows the person who gave me the first book as a present. I read the first. My fraternity big brother gave me the first book as a present in college, and I've read the first book like 3 times. I've listened to it once, and I've watched the terrible movie. Well, I wouldn't say terrible. Some people think it's terrible, and I didn't like it, but a lot of people.
The Lynch one?
I've watched the terrible movie, and I didn't pay a lot of attention because I was with an attractive man, and we got bored and had sex instead. And then I watched the new movie twice, and I've watched the new second. So I'm like somewhat familiar. I haven't read the series because I've heard it's not worth it. But yeah.
I've managed to avoid almost all of it. semi unintentionally, but also like when something is like both very popular and also like very dense, like there's a lot of material, I like nope out very quickly. I also haven't watched I think I've managed to see 2 Marvel movies, and other than that I've been like, nope, I can't commit to this.
I mean, that one I definitely congratulate you for.
I just like twinks in space, so I'm like, in this media.
That's why they made Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly.
Another twinks in space.
There's that one, The City of a Thousand Planets, that one, another twink in space. Of course I'm going to watch it.
So, yeah, Hoots is here because she's not as into science fiction, which is her perspective, but it means I might have to explain some stuff.
Yes.
So for people who don't know, just as a general breakdown, which is going to be really hard, Dune is about a super far future space empire, and it is centered around the titular planet Dune, where there is essentially no water of any kind to speak of, and the people who live there live in an incredibly harsh survival situation at all times, but is the only place in the world where the magic super mind-expanding drug that makes space travel possible exists.
Spice melange.
And so it is the most important thing in the entire universe.
No Dune, no interstellar space travel. So it's kind of important. So whoever controls this planet is kind of a big deal, has a lot of leverage over the rest of, the empire.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other stuff where it's a general critique of the white savior narrative, and some people argue how well it actually pulled that off, but that's an entire other meta-narrative can of fish. The thing that got me thinking about it for definitions is, like you were saying, Rosencreutz, that they go out of their way to explain everything, which made me think about, one, how necessary is the explanation part for something to, count as general science fiction? And also with Dune specifically, the thing that I thought was really fascinating is I feel like people see it as fantastical and more magical than other science fiction because he very intentionally leaned into the time period from which he was writing, which was, 60s, 70s, new age stuff. And instead of taking it to like all of our magic and whatever is done with super advanced technology, he kind of went the other direction and went, what if humans kept mind expanding themselves in that very sort of, 60s drug trip sort of way until they developed their own superhuman abilities.
I mean, like famously in the setting, there's a whole revolution and destruction of technology because they find that they cannot trust it. With the Butlerian Jihad, and that necessitates that they then take an angle that's not even like biohacking per se, so much as just like they keep kind of honing genetics with the mentats and other figures throughout the whole thing, of course.
Yeah, it's a mix between like it's been hundreds of thousands of years. It's like so far in the future that they've pretty much forgotten where Earth even is, and it is also set 300,000 years after the AI uprising, so they basically have a mix of human evolution and super intense training.
I think this is really interesting because this I think foregrounds the idea of the fiction telling the description the fiction tells you and how quote magic end quote happens is part of our consumption of it as science fiction or fantasy, right? Like as soon as you say, oh, you can teleport because magic, that's fantasy, but oh, you can teleport because you can warp space fabric and duplicate yourself into another locus, blah, 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 blah. Then like, this is science fiction. It's the trappings of language, I think, that sometimes makes something science fiction fantasy, right? Like, so Vivian Sobchak in her essay Screening Space writes about this idea of how the repetition of specific images in early science fiction cinema, and not images as in like it looks the same in different movies, but the fact that there is a robot in this movie and a robot in this movie, and this is how we connect them together as both science fiction, right? So I think this idea of it telling us that, oh, the Bene Gesserit's voice is because it hacks the part of the brain that is used to obeying orders by paying attention to specific modulations of frequency, makes it in some ways more sci-fi than saying my voice can control you, which is like, Wheel of Time compulsion, right? So I think that is one of the keys in how something is marketed as sci-fi or fantasy or one of the other genres of speculative.
Yeah, and I feel like a funny inverse of that is that God, this is going to be such a random reach, but like I think it was the Might and Magic series, just like randomly, like partway through the second or third game, they're like, actually, it turns out that like the future, the like really strong, powerful, like ancient technology that's here, it's aliens. And other than that, before that, it was like a generic elf fantasy world kind of space, and then suddenly there's alien spaceships, and like I've seen that trope happen more than once at this point, where like they take something that was very hardcore, obviously just generic fantasy, and then they throw aliens into the mix, and now you're like, I guess there's planets involved or something.
That was one of the things I was going to specifically bring up. It's a slightly older book series, but I don't know how many people are familiar with the Dragon Riders of Pern.
Yep.
Anne McCaffrey, right?
Yes. Anne McCaffrey's series that is, feudalism, dragons, psychic connections with dragons, weird kinky sex scenes with dragons. Don't read too much into it.
Good times.
There's an entire book. There's multiple books that are just dragons, dragon riders, people like doing medieval shenanigans with dragons. And then they find the colony ship that they all got to the planet on.
Surprise.
Yeah, what's the thing? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Whose law is that? I forget.
Yeah, that's the 3 laws of sci-fi. Was that Philip K. Dick or was that...
I don't think it was Philip K. Dick, but I don't remember who it was.
Yeah, now I'm having trouble remembering.
The TTRPG Numenera, right, which is Monte Cook Games, one of their like flagship games that started their cipher system that's very popular, and then the video game that came out of it, Torment: Tides of Numenera, which is the spiritual successor of Planescape Torment. That has that kind of premise, like it's a world 1 billion years in the future. It's Earth 1 billion years in the future, which is an unimaginable amount of time. Like literally, we cannot imagine it. And the idea is, okay, so it's 1 billion years in the future. Why is the sun still around? We have no idea. But there have been, it's called the 9th world. There have been 9 major civilizations on Earth. Some of them can bend space-time. Some of them had technology to terraform planets and stars. Some of them could go into different realities. And the idea is that a lot of the RPG, a lot of the characters can do magical stuff. Like there's part of the game mechanics where there's all this magical stuff. But it tells you this is in reality technology that you can no longer understand because it's so alien to you, right? And some of the fun of playing the game, I was an actual play of it once, some of the fun of playing the game is you play characters who call things magic or angels or holiness and stuff, when it's actually aesthetically to the players, aesthetically it's a laser gun, right? Or a teleporting device that we aesthetically think of as sci-fi, but your characters think of as fantasy, but at some level it is fantasy because it's so far magical and sufficiently advanced technology, right? And I think that's really, really interesting.
So since we've gotten into some of the definitional stuff here, I'm actually really curious. I asked everyone to come up with sort of a general definition in their head of what they would consider to be science fiction. And I'm actually pretty curious because I think the 3 of us have been dominating the conversation a little bit right now. Hoots, what was yours? Because you're the most sort of outside, not in the weeds perspective on this, since you don't fill your life with it the way the rest of us do.
Really broadly, a genre that just primarily relies on futuristic settings and narratives involving technology, space and time travel, etc. I believe the what is usually recognized as the first work of sci-fi was Frankenstein, right?
Yes.
And I guess that kind of ties to the, like, because sci-fi and fantasy are always so interlinked. And I think what kind of made Frankenstein this first work of sci-fi is you were taking essentially a fantasy concept, right? Necromancy, and grounding it in technology, and I guess this would have been a work of maybe the early early scientific period. Mary Shelley was 1830s, right?
Yeah, so,
early 1800s. So.
Yeah, as I understand it, it's generally agreed that Frankenstein is written in the sort of romantic tradition, where you're supposed to reference a lot of really heady novels to prove how smart you are. And that was like cutting edge science at the time. Was like, we just figured out that muscles move because of electricity, and we still don't know what either of those things are. Right.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, grounding what is what would have been a fantasy concept 10 years earlier in scientific discovery.
And say that the concept of someone animating a body to turn it into a person is not new, even when Shelley came around, but how it's being described.
Yeah, the method.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, because we had Lazarus, and I don't know the name of what that was based on in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's something.
So, real old trope.
Well, that's like literally the first written down story in human history.
That we have.
Yeah, that we have.
Yes. Note to self, get a time machine, go back in time. And
is it a magical time machine or a sci-fi time?
No, it's a sci-fi time machine, kids me.
So I guess generally, so this is what I want to do. I like have my own sort of like background ideas about what sci-fi is, but I'm not going to spoil it yet, because what I'm mainly going to do is try to break everyone else's definition for fun, basically.
Okay.
Excellent.
So I guess in general, with everybody's sort of thoughts on it, how many people included futuristic in their general conception of science fiction?
I definitely had like future, but also kind of near future included, because like I'm very blurry on the sense of whether or not near future, like where near future starts, and whether like cyberpunk, for example, is super blurry, because like you could say that cyberpunk is now, but we're not like dystopia enough yet.
Yeah,
for it.
true.
But, like, things are cyberpunk in the world right now? Question mark.
Futurism can also be retrofuturism. Like there are things that are aesthetically futuristic, but also set in the past. Like futuristic is kind of a broad term in the way that sci-fi is a broad term.
Yeah, like how Fallout is the future of the 1950s.
I love retrofuturist ideas. They're so depictions. They're so interesting. They also give us a glimpse into what people in the past thought the future would look like.
I know.
Also, they're nostalgic. Like I have seen modern retrofuturist things that are like, this isn't even made in the 70s, but it continues the 70s. It's so cool.
I love Tomorrowland at Disneyland, and I wish that they would keep it that kind of retrofuturistic aesthetic. But
I know
Star Wars is kind of slowly encroaching all over, which is another kind of like retrofuturism, I guess. But I like that, like specifically 50s futuristic aesthetic.
Well, because you have like the utopian, hopeful retrofuturism and the dystopian retrofuturism of like Fallout and Star Wars.
Right. And Star Wars is very Western.
So Star Wars we're going to get to in a second, because that's one of the that was a defining science fiction moment for something that has so much argument about whether or not it counts. But I think one thing that I want to complicate, especially with future and near future, which I thought of first too, but then what about steampunk?
Right, that's retrofuturism in a sense.
Yeah, that's still a kind of futurism.
But it's almost always set in like the 1800s. It's historical fiction, but alternate historical fiction with technology.
I could be wrong here, but I don't know that futurism and futuristic necessarily means in our future.
doesn't have to be relative to our current point in time. It could be relative to somebody else.
Yeah, like the book my book that's coming out next month posits a past where like ancient India was the global colonizer because they had giant mechs, right? But they're made of chainmail, right? But then there's like spoilers, other thing, no spoiler, but other things involved. So like, is that futurism, sci-fi, retrofuturism?
Alternate history.
Is that alternate history, but with giant mechs? Like,
if your alt history stops at like 1920, then none of it was futurism. Duh. Like that's the problem there, I guess, is that if you make a point of deviation, then suddenly you can, like, if the point of deviation is supposed to be that like, oh, in like the 1600s they discovered some magical resource that like we can't comprehend in our world, but in their world became like equivalent to coal, their version of like, you know, fueling everything. And then that meant that by the year 1970 in our timeline, their timeline had like flying cars. Right. Does that make it futuristic? It's futuristic because it has the concept of being beyond us, but it's not the future because it isn't past our timeline.
Right. I see futuristic as an aesthetic adjective.
A trapping, perhaps, of science fiction, but not a necessary component.
A vibe.
Yeah, it's very vibe, and I think what we're going to get to is vibes based.
Yeah.
I also think there's in the same essay that I was quoting earlier from Isaac Asimov, I'm not going to quote it because this entire definition is 2 paragraphs, but he drew an interesting distinction that I think I haven't seen before, which is a more baseline distinction, because we always like argue like sci-fi versus fantasy, speculative fiction, etc. But he said that a more basic split that you kind of have to accept for any of this is the difference between realistic fiction, which he kind of defines as fiction which didn't happen, but there's absolutely no reason that it couldn't happen or have happened, versus what he has termed surrealistic fiction, which is events that play out against a social background that do not exist, have not existed, and could not exist.
I think that is complicated by the existence of works such as The City in the City, for example, right? Where the City in the City's premise is that in Eastern Europe, there are 2 countries that overlap, that literally occupy the same physical space, but you are trained from birth to not pay attention to buildings and people who are in the other country and pay attention to the building people in your country. It's illegal to cross them. You have to like go into the embassy and then come out of the embassy again to be like, great, I'm in the other place, right? Theoretically, could happen. It is at the edge of plausibility, but theoretically it could happen. Or The Handmaiden, right? Where theoretically it could happen, but it is not at the edge of possibility anymore, especially given what's happening in the United States and other parts of the world. So this idea of making this term up, but social science fiction, where we are extrapolating and speculating on social truths and realities versus technological truths and realities, where do those fall in this continuum of fantastical science fiction?
Well, I think that just kind of becomes alt history again, doesn't it? Like the idea of it being plausible or speculative, if it's not rooted in something that's kind of like a rule of the universe or like bending a rule of physics or something, which I'm not saying they all have to, but if it's not rooted in that and it's instead rooted in like a timeline juncture that happened, then that becomes alternate history by design, even if it is also kind of predicated on being almost impossible or very possible. Like, you know, Anno Dracula, is that sci-fi? I wouldn't say so, and it's not really history because it requires that Dracula existed, but like it still is something that deviates a timeline, and in that way people would kind of see it as it takes place in history. History is a setting, if that makes sense.
Do you feel like alternate history doesn't fall under the umbrella of sci-fi? Because I kind of feel like it's a subgenre.
I feel like the problem is that it has like a distinct split where like if the alternate history happens because of something science-y, yes, and if not, no. And that's like super arbitrary, but it's because you're kind of overlapping 2 genre things at once. Like there's the Venn diagram moment.
I think we fall back to the aesthetic trappings, right? Because when I have to make a distinction, which I put alternate history under the umbrella of speculative fiction, right? Even if it's not that speculative. I don't necessarily call it science fiction, but what was that one book? It was like a Hugo winner, The Days of Salt and Saffron or something. That posits like, what if the Black Death killed, instead of 14% of Europe, what if it killed 40% of Europe, right? Now what happens, right? And so it posits a very different world, but I would be like, that doesn't seem very sci-fi to me. It is extremely plausible for the Black Death to kill more people, right? And now we live in a different world. We live in a world where Baghdad is the cultural center of the planet. We live in a world where Africa was not colonized and there are all these mini nations all over, right? So I would fiction, even though many wouldn't, because some people don't think of that kind of alternate history as sci-fi. But then the question becomes, well, what novel that's set in the past is not alternate history? Is Pride and Prejudice alternate history? Those characters and stuff didn't exist. But is that alternate history? It posits an alternative history, right?
It's a thing that didn't happen, but it's also like so plain and contained in a way. Like if for some reason in Persuasion, when they talk about Napoleon, they mention that he lost a battle that he never fought, then that would suddenly make it alternate history by accident. They would have stumbled, or I guess Austen would have stumbled herself into having written an alternate history. But like, most of what happens in these books isn't necessarily verifiable, but it doesn't conflict with the reality that we know.
I also think we're getting into a weird place with that, since Jane Austen was writing
at the time
contemporaneously with the events. So now we view it as historical, but at the time it would have just been literary fiction.
Yeah.
Romance.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Espen Arseth, in one of his essays, I forget which one, says that, I don't fully believe in it, but I get the point of it. He says, the single most important piece of information a reader has about a piece of work is who the author is, which I don't agree with in that hyperbolic sense. But what you just said, like, yes, if I read Pride and Prejudice not knowing anything about the author, I might be like, oh, historical fiction, right? But once I know who the author is and the social milieu that she was used to, I'd be like, and there's also why it's okay to accept the fact that, yes, living for a week with a man you're not married to is the worst sin you can do. While if a modern author wrote that, I'd be like, what are you telling us about your beliefs about human relationships, right? But one thing I think that that Rosencreutz really hits on is this idea of that Rosenkreutz's point there wasn't about the aesthetic trappings, it was about our construction of what that story tells us about the world, right? If the Napoleon thing is really big, because as soon as we know that, if the text says Napoleon won and now ruled the world for 10 years, that changes our conception of the world and how it exists. And I think that fits really well into not a definition, but a definitional discussion that Samuel Delany has in his essay about 5750 words, where he talks about science fiction is more about the relationships between the reader and a construction of reality. And he gives this really interesting example where he says, okay, think of a winged dog, okay? A winged dog. In a realist work, a winged dog does not exist. Great. In a fantasy work, a winged dog, you accept it exists, and you probably picture it as, it's a dog with wings, and it's fantasy, so it works. He says that in sci-fi, and I'm going to quote here, in sci-fi, quote, one wonders whether the dog has 4 legs or not. The visual correction must include modifications of breastbone and musculature if the wings are to be functional, as well as a whole slew of other factors from hollow bones to heart rate, end quote, right? So I think what Delany is trying to say is that in science fiction, in fantasy, you just accept the weirdness. Like, it's weird, it's fantasy. I mean, if you're not accepting it, then you become one of those annoying people on the internet who's like, why is this happening in this fantasy, right? But I think Delaney's saying in sci-fi, once you are thinking of it as sci-fi, you're like, oh, how did this winged dog occur? And that key question of that key point that the reader is thinking about, how does this occur? What allows it to occur? What are the realities that let this dog be winged? For Delany, I think, is more of a thing of like, this is sci-fi.
Which would make Game of Thrones a work of science fiction.
Indeed.
Possibly, if you are thinking of how are these occurring, Delaney might agree with that.
They made a very big point about designing the dragons so that they were consistent with similar creatures that exist in our universe.
Right.
Which again is like an overlap between fantasy and sci-fi is what distinguishes them, and sometimes maybe nothing.
Right. And I think the idea of Dune is a good example, because the fact that the author takes time to make us think about, the prana bindu works because you can actually control the muscles of your body in this small way because of mental training you have, I think leans it towards Delaney's idea of what sci-fi is in terms of the mode of thought about how reality exists, right? Which I think is quite...
Does anybody want to read a long quote for me? Because I don't want to be the only one who's reading things on here.
That was spoken much for a bit.
Sorry, I read a long quote too.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. But half of this thing is going to be long quotes. So this is a excerpt from one of my favorite little essays on science fiction, which is Ursula K. Le Guin's Introduction to the Left Hand of Darkness.
Ooh.
Which I need to get around to reading still.
It's
But anyway,
seminal, right?
Yes.
this book is not extrapolative. If you like, you can read it, and a lot of other science fiction, as a thought experiment. Let's say Mary Shelley's, that a young doctor creates a human being in his laboratory. Let's say Philip K. Dick, that the Allies lost the Second World War. Let's say this or that is such and so, and see what happens. In a story so conceived, the moral complexity proper to the modern novel need not be sacrificed, nor is there any built-in dead end. Thought and intuition can move freely within the bounds set only by the terms of the experiment, which may be very large indeed. The purpose of a thought experiment, as the term was used in Schrodinger's and other physicists, is not to predict the future. Indeed, Schrodinger's most famous thought experiment goes to show that the future, on the quantum level, cannot be predicted, but to describe reality, the present world. Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive.
I think an interesting thing about that is that fundamentally, if you put that in kind of a continuity with what we were talking about prior, it almost puts science fiction into this position of, I'm not going to say pretentiousness because it's not an intentional thing, but it's like what we've actually sort of established is this idea that like it's something that has to have a sense of grounding more than fantasy would. It has to have a sense of like the bar for suspending your disbelief is a lot higher because you have to have that like evidencing of like why things are the way they are. And then there's sort of implicit in Le Guin and in other works of hers as well, this sort of mentioning of like there's a point, something that is going to make you think, to have you discuss it. And like, I'm not saying fantasy doesn't do that, but like perhaps that fantasy has the leeway to kind of be more about nothing or accidentally about things by just holding a mirror up to the author or whatever. But there seems to be like a pretty strong sense of like, there's a meaning to stuff, a gravity to stuff, a heft.
Yeah, I'm gonna work in another quote because it's useful to the discussion, and especially since we've been talking about Dune since I brought it up in the first place. But you know, there's a book called The Road to Dune, which was written after Frank Herbert's death, but the introduction is written by Bill Ransom, who worked with Frank Herbert a lot, and he has a quote in there about Frank Herbert's ethos according to science fiction, which I think matches up in here. Frank believed that poetry was the apex of human language. He also believed that science fiction was the only genre whose subject matter attempted to define what it is to be human. We use contact with aliens of alien environments as impetus or backdrop for human interactions. Science fiction characters solve their own problems. Neither magic spells nor gods come to their aid, and sometimes they have to build some intriguing gadgets to save their skins. Humans go to books to see how other humans solve human problems.
I think both that quote and Rosenkreutz's point interact with, because this idea of what, like, we don't rely on gods, we don't rely on this, or we have to be grounded, is extremely tied to what we think of as real or grounded, right? Because to some people, gods are extremely real, right? To some people, the presence of the dead lingering after bodily death is extremely real, and that's their reality, right? In The History of Science Fiction, Adam Roberts writes about this idea that our current conception of science fiction emerged kind of alongside the move from the religious to secular in Western Europe, right? And our ideas of science fiction, thus, are very tied to Western Europe and Western ideas of what is real, what is grounded, what is reality, also what is technology, right? The creation of fire, the creation of paper is technology, but often if we talk about the creation of fire, that makes us think of mythic or mythics fantasy and not sci-fi as much, right? Similarly, if we talk about contacting the dead, to some people, this might be, well, this is a real reality that we do on a daily basis, and anything tied to that would thus be science fiction because it's based on a real technology we have about contacting the dead by leaving offerings, right? So I think there's this idea of when we talk about what is science fiction, I think I would go as far as to say that all of us on this podcast come from a very Western-centric perspective of that, even though some of us may not have grown up in the West, but the fact that Western media proliferates so much, and I know this is true for me, I did not grow up in the West, but Western media filled my life. This idea is very extremely specific to a certain time. That's why Afrofuturism feels very different in many ways. I'm not very knowledgeable about Afrofuturism, just putting that out there, but it can feel very different because it takes different axioms and different assumptions as the baseline, right?
Which I was even thinking about, because one of the things that I have on my little, does this count list was Black Panther, which may be one of the two Marvel movies you saw. Hoots, I'm not sure.
It was not.
Can you tell us which ones are the two that you've watched?
I saw the original Avengers way back when it came out. And then I saw Guardians of the Galaxy when it came out. So again, I haven't seen them in over a decade now.
But pretty good ones. You can really take in those two without, it really kind of driving you to be, I need to watch every single thing now.
Yeah, I had a good time watching them, but at a certain point, it was just like, I got a little commitment phobic. More movies started coming out, and I was like, I can't commit to this.
So just broadly,
sorry, you were telling us about Black Panther. Yeah,
Black Panther is very Afrofuturistic aesthetically, but I mean, the original story was written for a Western audience in comic books. The movie was obviously written for a Western audience in the wider Marvel stuff. So it is just there's a small country in Africa that has access to this super mineral that gave it incredibly advanced technology all the way back through history, and that let them insulate themselves from colonialism is the basic general idea. But I would say that even in that, it's dealing with a very Western idea of what even counts as that, because they do have technology. They've got very advanced technology. We've got what Western people would really recognize of advanced technology. It just all has an Afrofuturist paint job on top of it.
Because it was written by Americans.
Yes.
Right? Even if it was written by Black Americans, it was written by Americans who grew up in an American milieu and context.
Which is kind of a problem because science fiction is inherently a Western genre. The first general work of sci-fi, as you said, Hoots, is Frankenstein, but that was kind of decided after the fact.
Right.
After Jules Verne sort of invented the genre as we think of it now, because all of Jules Verne books were very hard sci-fi for the time, very engineering and hard science. Though I do think that's kind of funny, because I was rereading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea a bit ago, and I think it kind of gets to this, one of the problems that I have with a lot of people talking about science fiction is inherently wrapped up in our, explanations of technology and science. Because one of the things that Jules Verne did in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was respond to criticisms that some of his stories didn't include enough hard science. So
I didn't know that.
Several characters throughout the book will look outside and go, there is a fish in the genus Chrysonidae, in the phylum whatever, that includes this entire list of taxonomy for like a page and a half.
Showing it off.
Because I've never actually read a strict translation of Jules Verne or the original in French. I've only read kids. Like I haven't read any Jules Verne as an adult. I've only read like kids' versions. So I didn't know any of the like these minutiae.
It turns out we've gotten ourselves abducted by this weird Captain Nemo guy, and all his crew are like huge nerds. Get us out of here!
But I think I got us onto a side point because like I always critique whether or not science fiction has to be rooted in scientific explanation or not, which I do think is an important one that I'd like to look at. But I think everyone else was sort of on how pretentious does it have to be to make us all think about stuff in a deep way.
I mean, I think you can say
Right.
about
Well, but I do think-
any genre, though, right? Like, how pretentious is this fantasy? How pretentious is it? I hate it. Pretension is... Okay, I was buying Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell as a present for someone, so I went to the bookstore and I'm looking in the sci-fi fantasy section and it's not there, and I'm like, hey, do you have a copy of this in the back room or something? Like, oh no, we have it out front. I'm like, oh well, I checked and there's no Jonathan Strange. They're like, oh, it's not in sci-fi fantasy, it's under British literary fiction. And I'm like, angry. It's about two wizards. It is about two wizards. Because they're like, oh, it's pretentious enough to get to here.
That is just fiction, and it's kind of one of those things where once you start genreifying things, then you kind of have to wait. Like, is it just that once it gets popular enough, it like transcends? Like, I don't know if people would call Harry Potter fantasy ever. It's
They'll
just
call it
fiction,
children's fantasy.
Yeah, well, it's young adults.
or like a young adult book,
Young
and that's a
adult.
genre that means nothing. That means
It's still in the
nothing.
children's section of Barnes and Noble, but it is young adults.
Yeah.
And when we get to age categorization, genres kind of fall apart, though, right?
Right.
Which I do think
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I think I do have a slight criticism of for Ursula K. Le Guin, as much as I really love her general writing. This entire essay, which is the intro to The Left Hand of Darkness, kind of has that, why are you calling my stuff science fiction, and then why is my stuff science fiction lesser than other writing? Because genre fiction is sort of this dirty word in literature.
Right.
But you could equally ask the question, why is literary fiction so much better?
Right. And I don't call it literary fiction anymore. When I teach, I call it realist fiction because I'm like, screw that. All of this is literary, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not all realist either. It's kind of about if it enters the canon. Because, like, is Picture of Dorian Gray realist? Not at all. It has
Right, or is
an
it
inherently
Mm-hmm.
magical premise. But if you're reading it and you get through the first third of it, it could be grounded to you. Or, you know, is it science fiction because it has just like one object that we understand the rules of as the thing progresses? Not really, but like that's why we just end up being like, well, but it's successful, so it's literature. We'll just throw it in that.
Recently I was reading for one of the like NPR book club things they were doing during the pandemic. Was Akira and the Sun, which was written really recently by, I forget the name of the author now. I'd have to like walk over to my entire bookshelf, and I don't want to do that right now. But this author usually writes really hardcore, like super well-respected literature, and this whole thing was like, oh, but he wrote a book about a robot, though. Like, now we're having a crisis because this is science fiction, and that's bad.
Oh, God.
Well, the weird division between quote literary fiction and science fiction and genre fiction in general has some interesting and complicated roots that are weirdly connected to the CIA.
Oh.
Really? Oh, is it related to that whole abstract expressionist stuff that they also did?
Washington Color School, baby.
Kind of, yeah. So who here is familiar with the Iowa Writers Workshop?
Yeah. It's like really, really, really prestigious and famous.
Yes. So I did my undergrad at the University of Iowa.
I actually didn't know that.
Yes, and so some of the I took several creative writing classes because I like writing, and one of the things is that those classes for undergrads tend to be taught by grad students at the Writers Workshop, which means that I was working. I was taking classes from people that were involved there, and this is really prestigious. And it is one of those things that's been sort of a thing for decades now, and it became a thing because there was a guy, I forget his name right now, that was like, all right, hey CIA, if you give me money to get this thing started, I'll put together a writing environment that encourages anti-communist sort of literature. And by that, we mean literature that is not necessarily about anything.
Yeah, this is literally the whole abstract expressionism thing all over again, right? The CIA
they Jackson Pollock-ified it.
war.
Yeah, we want to be having literature that is more about the expressions, the experience, but not the big ideas. And we're going. The whole concept of show don't tell really became their whole thing to the show only and never tell. And so it was sort of, and this began to encourage, as part of that program, a general poo-pooing of anything that had a big idea message. And so genre fiction, which tends to have big idea messaging in it in some fashion, was, as a result, being pushed out of consideration for the writer's workshop. And so this, when I went there, it was still, decades after, this, guy did this thing. I'm pretty sure he was well dead by that point. And there's still this sort of vibe there. And so several of the instructors that I was interacting with, they're like, yeah, this isn't really kind of my thing at all. So I don't really know how to really help you with your writing, because I like to write a lot of science fiction. But I did have one guy who was like, yeah, heck yeah, I'm all about sci-fi. This is great.
I mean,
let's jam.
I'm a sci-fi writer, right? And in the writing circles, or I should say I'm a speculative fiction writer. In the writing circles, more than just what Isaacs is saying, where people are like, oh, I don't know how to help you with this. I've met people who are like, yeah, they've done their MFAs and stuff, and the faculty are actually hostile, right? Mm-hmm. They're not just like, we can't help you with this. They're like, why would you write this? This is not as good. Don't write this. This is bad. Very few university programs in writing, for example, actually encourage speculative fiction writing or, quote, genre writing, end quote. And I think that's so sad. Luckily, I've never had someone say to my face, oh, you write sci-fi? That's so much less interesting. Partially because I hang out with a lot of nerds, and partially because it's hard to say that to a face with someone who is a professor. And be like, your writing is not worth anything. I'm like, are you a professor? Right? But this exists.
I feel like this is still touching on how we really define like what is and isn't sci-fi, and but also like what is and isn't part of the literary canon by aesthetics. It is definitionally just an aesthetic thing. I've been thinking I just thought like It Follows to me still feels like a little bit sci-fi, and I think it's probably just because she has the little shell e-reader. There's like just aesthetic choices that make things sci-fi in my mind, and I think that aesthetic is also why genre fiction really gets kind of poo-pooed by a lot of people. But then you can name pieces of genre fiction that have been accepted as pieces of literature. It's all just aesthetic.
Annette Kuhn writes that our definition of sci-fi is influenced very literally and very really by 80s and 90s film, and that we construct what sci-fi means because once we started seeing sci-fi in film, that really affected us as society, like, this is what sci-fi is. And that became now what sci-fi is. And again, that, of course, that's 80s and 90s Western films, right? Because the producers were larger in the West at that time. Right now, you could argue that Bollywood is larger than anything. But I think that, so I think that aesthetic thing is totally it. Like, it's what we imagine it looks like. And what you were saying earlier, I forget which media you mentioned about Hoots, but it was about like, is this thing magical or is this thing has a sciencey explanation?
Oh, right. Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones. We aesthetically think of that as fantasy, but if you try to define something by like there's rooted rules to the universe, or there's like there's like some kind of biological truth to the fantasy creatures, then it would count as sci-fi. I think that's why the definition shifts from person to person, because we all have different like aesthetic ideas about like what sci-fi is. I would not call Game of Thrones sci-fi because aesthetically it feels like a piece of fantasy to me, and I think most people probably agree with that. But if we constructed these like very strict rules about what is sci-fi, then I think it is. Or if in the final book, if he ever actually finished it, if he said, and this all happened on Earth 10,000 years in the future, then I think a lot of people would be like, well, 10,000 years in the future, it's sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like, isn't technically Lord of the Rings, doesn't it happen on Earth, right? Like,
Middle Earth,
Yeah. You know, Earth
but
in the
that
ancient
is high
past.
fantasy. And I mean, sci-fi and fantasy have got like a very like strong overlap. So it kind of makes sense that they go together a lot. But it's the same thing with like a lot of horror works are also works of sci-fi. Frankenstein being the OG, like
Yes.
Alien is horror and sci-fi, yeah.
absolutely, yeah. So a lot of the times I feel like, again, there's like cross genre and there's subgenre, and then other times I feel like people can argue things like again, is It Follows a work of sci-fi because they have weird gadgets in it, or is it a work of horror fantasy because there's like a demon in it? Like,
Right.
I think it's
Adam
all of
Roberts-
these things.
Adam Roberts, who I cited before, talks about this idea that there is no platonic eternal of what is sci-fi and fantasy. It's defined by social and historical context. And an interesting example of this is I have a story in Lightspeed magazine called "Writing You," and it's in the form of like a kind of like a letter or a speech that the protagonist, that someone is telling you, and you is their dead lover, and the idea is they're recounting how the dead lover is how the funeral rites are going to happen, which is where the dead lover's skin is going to be removed, dried, preserved, cut into pages, sewn into a book, and then there'll be a specific way in where the dead lover's life story will then be written into the book and then preserved and blah, 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 all this thing, right? And I was quite happy with this story. It is based on my divorce, but anyway. I was quite happy with the story. Even my ex-husband liked the story. He's like, oh, it's a good story. After our divorce, he liked it. But there's one of the speculative fiction review online blogs, Tangent Online, wrote about how they were reviewing the stories in that issue of Lightspeed. And they're like, we will not review Writing You because it is not speculative fiction. Right? And I was joking about this with my writer friends. They're like, oh, maybe the editor of that magazine often, cuts his lover's skin open.
Discovered a culture where that happens.
That's why it's not fiction for that, right? But then and again, the aesthetically, it is clearly speculative fiction. But you could, if you want to be very strict, you could make the argument that yes, there have been societies in the world that have written books on human skin. And so this is plausible, and therefore this is not speculative fiction. I think Brown has a book written on human skin in their Brown's museum. So they're like, that person, therefore this is not spec fic. And I'm like, well, so that I think that is a really good example of defined by social and historic context, right? I think most people agree that is speculative fiction, but his context, I don't know if it's their context.
You got to start peppering in tablets.
Whereas if you had written a prologue into it about advocating for being a big political movement, advocating for people being able to do with whatever they want with their corpses in the USA in 2025, then they would have been like, stamp of approval. There you go.
I mean, to be fair, Tangent Online has interesting views in their reviews sometimes. So I'm like,
So I think that brings us around a little bit to something that we are eventually going to have to talk about, which is Star Wars. Very, skin book heavy, as we know. But I think just as far as the social idea goes, because Star Wars is aesthetically science fiction. There's no arguing. It's in space. It's also inspiration from earlier science fiction works. And it is a seminal sci-fi work in that it influenced all science fiction aesthetic from that point onward. But story-wise, it is fantasy. It is
Set
mythic.
in the past.
Like the start, the
Mythic
intro
fantasy.
is fantasy. It's a long time ago in a kingdom far, far away.
Yeah.
But in space.
Once upon a
The
time.
funny thing about it is that it almost feels like I constantly have to remind myself of the timeline of when Dune happened and when Star Wars happened, because in a very funny way, if you don't know those timelines, it almost feels like you can read Dune as a critique of Star Wars.
Well, because, I mean, very directly, Dune was a critique of a hero's journey and a man with 1,000 faces. And Star Wars is archetypically a man with 1,000 faces.
Yes. Yeah. This is interesting, right? Because this brings back, I think, Delaney's idea, right? Like, for example, the Force. We don't, until you hit midi-chlorians, which a lot of people don't like thinking about. But in Star Wars, we just accept the Force. We're like, yeah, it's the Force, right? It's this mystical thing, and we don't examine why and how. And I would think that's the winged dog example again, right? Like, to Delaney, that element of storytelling is fantastical and not science fiction, because we don't, the reader or the viewer, the consumer, I don't like saying consumer for art, the experiencer isn't prompted to, or doesn't feel the need to explore why the Force exists, or what the details about it. It's magical. It's a thing, right? And secondly, in Jeff King and Tanya Kriskvinska, I don't know how to say their name, sorry, in their book Science Fiction Cinema, I like this definition as a working definition, not a deep definition, but quote, sci-fi deals with the problems and promises offered by science, technology, and rationality in an imaginative context. End quote, right? It's a good working definition. And in that sense, Dune, in some sense, deals with the problems offered by science and technology, while Star Wars, the science technology, isn't the heart of the story in any sense. Like, Dune is about scarcity and resources and things, in one sense. There are lots of things that Dune is about, right? While Star Wars, kind of what you were saying, aesthetically is sci-fi, but from the story, what the issues are, it's not really about the problems of science, technology, and rationality. It's about good versus evil, which is a classic fantasy thing, right?
Yeah. It is a fantasy story, but it is the experience of consuming it is a sci-fi experience.
Which I do
You
like,
know what I mean?
space fantasy as a genre. Like, I love it. But I do think that, like, we wouldn't be having the discussion at all if you had the Force in, Willow, in a fantasy movie where people did the Force exactly as described. We wouldn't be having the discussion because there's spaceships involved.
Yeah.
Well, I think Star Wars has the
vibes.
funny problem of, like, because it is fantasy that's in space, but it has the sci-fi aesthetic, it has invited in the pedants, and they have come in, and in some ways they'll just say, okay, the Force is fine, I accept. They're space wizards. I'm never going to call them a space wizard ever again. I'm just doing that the one time, and then I'm going to move on. And then they'll get into a part where they'll be like, well, but the B-17 droid wasn't made until after the collapse of the Empire. So they'll get into those like, little small-ass semantic things. And they're correct. And that's why they have to have a keeper of the holocron at Disney who like has all the lore in like a book and plotted out so no one can like, disregard it and they don't get into the hell pit that was the Legends canon where there was like, they were just contracting random people to write books and they'd be like, I think Han Solo's son, he's gonna be like this, and just like writes a whole book where he's gonna meet the devil on Yavin, and like you're like, okay, I guess that's now part of the canon. Disney undid all that because they realized it was like a complete nightmare.
It was a hot mess.
That kind of nightmare can only happen when you just kind of have like this non-entity world of like, yeah, sure, do whatever. It's fantasy. You can write another myth in this fantastical world. You don't have to have someone trained to understand all the science behind any of it.
So I think I want to get my definition at this point, I think, because we've been going into this idea, which I do somewhat agree with, the winged dog. And you have, fantasy says the winged dog is just there because it's funny looking and it does fantastical stuff. And sci-fi goes, well, what is the why of the winged dog? How does it work? But I would say personally that I think the more important thing that I tend to get for science fiction, and one of the things that I think complicates what fits into the genre for me overall, isn't like, why is the dog? How does the dog work? It's, okay, we have the technology to make winged dog. What does that do? What does that change about society? How do humans interact with the winged dog? What does the winged dog do socially to people? What does it change about the way that people's day-to-day lives operate? It's less about the, like, how does this technology work? It's the, what does this technology do to people? How does it change your interactions? Let's explore the limits and boundaries of humanity by how you interact with this, like, possibly minor or major change in the world.
This is essentially pointing out that that what the sci-fi is doing is it is asking a social history materialist question. Like, how does this impact people? What is the effect of this material thing within this world? And trickling out from there, what has this done to this history?
Yeah. I want to bring up an example that my partner brought up, which I thought was really interesting, which is the anime Death Note. Which, how familiar is everybody with that at all?
Yes.
I know the basics.
I actually read all the manga.
So you're more familiar than most of us, perhaps.
Right.
Finally, something I know about. I read all the manga in college, though, so it was a long while
Do you
ago.
want to give the quick definition for the people who don't know then, Hoots? Since I've only watched the anime twice,
Oh gosh, now I put myself on the spot. I read this like 10 years ago. So it's a teenager finds essentially a notebook where if you write down someone's name in it, they'll die of a heart attack. And I believe in later iterations, you can also write down the method of death so that for the TV shows and stuff, they could do more gruesome deaths. There's a demon.
God of death.
And there's another teenager who is also a detective who is trying to find the owner of the Death Note who's killing a bunch of people.
Which I think that's the thing. This is one of my partner's favorite animes. So they were pointing out that, like, by the stuff that I like in science fiction, it hits everything. Here's a relatively minor change. Like, it gives someone like a oversized amount of power, which is what the entire thing is about. But as far as the world goes, he's got an object that lets him do this one specific thing. A lot of the anime is built up around, like, what are the very specific rules? How does it work? What are the limitations of it? And a lot of it is like, okay, so he gets this power. What happens? What happens to him? What happens to the world? How does the world react to that? And it just got me thinking about, it's like, yeah, it's fantasy because he's given a magic book by demons. But as we were saying, sort of
it's aesthetically fantasy.
Like, if he'd been given a magic calculator by aliens that did exactly the same thing and it had exactly the same story, I think it would be considered a seminal sci-fi work.
Sci-fi.
I mean, famously,
yeah. Absolutely.
Famously, half the plot of it is about rules and litigating those rules. There's the one scene where he's like, okay, I'm going to drop the book we're going to go into the woods and I'm going to bury this book, but then I'm going to actually also touch the book and then hand it to you so that you're the owner of that book. So that in order to, like, mind wipe himself, he's like loopholing these, like, very concrete rules. Like, that's,
Yeah.
I don't know. In some ways that hits that, like, is this thing grounded question.
Yeah, it goes out of its way to ground itself, but not for no reason. Because I do think there's a lot of science fiction that gets so wrapped up in the, like, we have to be grounded, we have to explain how the whatever space engine works.
The aesthetics of explaining physics itself.
Yeah, to sort of the detriment of everything else. It's like, why are you explaining this?
Star Wars is the chief example that you don't to make it sci-fi.
Right,
I would say, like, again, following this, like, aesthetic definition, I would almost say that the original Jumanji is a work of fantasy and the reboots are works of science fiction because the reboots are rooted in a video game, which is aesthetically more sci-fi. And the original is a magical board game, which for completely vibes-based reasons feels more magical.
No one's going to say an Ouija board is like
one could argue that a board game is a technology, right?
A board game is totally a technology.
Well, I think they hand-wave that really well in the original, I think, because to the point, like, I think it's not so much just that, haunted board game is fantasy, haunted video game cartridge is sci-fi. It's that the things they're commenting on, the original's not actually commenting on the board game per se. They hand wave it because when the pieces move around in the old one, they go like, oh, it's magnets, and in the new one they go, oh, it's microchips, because the technology doesn't actually matter. But in the new ones, they're in a video game, and so the video game logic is an intrinsic part of the world that they're interacting with.
So they're actually quite different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because in the old one, it's intrudes in the real world, where in the new ones, they're in they're in a secondary world, right?
Right. Yeah. Which also I think makes it more aesthetically sci-fi, like parallel worlds.
Yeah. I want to take about Gepwin's idea of this idea of should the focus be on definition, and I am firmly in the belief that the world focuses too much on definitions,
Right.
Which is what happens when someone then says my story is not science fiction. I will not believe you. And I'm like, seriously, it's in Lightspeed magazine. But I think this harkens to one of the most famous science fiction literary thinkers, which is Darko Suvin, right? And Darko Suvin has thought, well, first off, Darko Suvin thought fantasy is terrible, which I disagree with. And a lot of scholars have been like, we like Darko Suvin's ideas, except for the idea that he thinks fantasy is terrible. Because Darko Suvin has the idea that good sci-fi creates estrangement of cognition, end quote, right? Where he's talking about this idea that there's what you were saying, one difference in the world, what he calls a novum, for example, a technology that does not exist in the real world, and this creates all these things, and we as the reader use that to examine real political social ideas, right? So the big example I've taught about even is the TV show Severance, right? Where there's one thing that is different, right? In Severance, who's watched Severance?
I'm caught up so far, yeah.
Okay, I've only watched the first season, and then I lost Apple because I had a new roommate. In Severance, the idea is there's a procedure, a surgical sort of procedure, that can cut off your work life from your any other life. So when you walk into the office, some implant in you or whatever, they don't actually go into details, senses that you're in the office, and immediately you have no memories of your life outside the office. You're a different person, basically. And once you leave the office, it switches back, so you are the outside person again, and the person you were inside is gone, kind of, right? And that... I know who wrote, what's her name? Eludes me. Who wrote the 5th season, the Broken Earth trilogy? N.K. Jemisin, right? N.K. Jemisin likes to think about this in her Ezra Klein interview. She talks about this idea of, think of one specific difference and then see how that affects, right? So I think in Severance, that sounds like, okay, cool. We have this cool idea. Great. This is an idea. This is fun. But then the show, I think, really masterfully says, okay, so if this is your what if, what are the interesting and weird consequences? One consequence that didn't really hit me until a couple of episodes into the show is that for the version of you that's at work, your entire existence is in the office. You never get to go to bed. You never get to leave the office. Like literally your whole conscious world is the office and there's nothing else, right? What does that do? And then that, of course, makes us think about, by virtue of this thing that is not real, it makes us think about, well, how does work life or how does capitalism happen in the real world, right? And so to Suvin, I think what's really important is these effects. Like what do these tropes of science fiction, what do these trappings make us actually think about? And then he thought fantasy was horrible because he said, no, fantasy is very traditional. And he's like, look at Lord of the Rings. It's all about conservative, good and evil. Blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, enough, Suvin. So I think this idea of cognitive estrangement has become very influential. And this idea of using sci-fi to comment on, critique, or explore real-world issues and problems is a very powerful thing. And like Catherine Hume writes that fantasy, and she's using the word fantasy not as a genre, but as like imagining things that are not real, and mimesis, which is the opposite, which is copying things that are real, are the two basic like impulses that power all of literature, right? Literature can be, she says, kind of described as like either you're copying the real or making an unreal, right? And Suvin says that by making the unreal, sci-fi makes us think about the real without getting caught in the problems of like, no, but this is not actually true, right? I made a game for a really big foundation in the States once, and they asked us to make a game about a very pressing technological need. And my co-designer and I ended up making the game set on Mars, because we're like, so that this frees you from being like, well, yeah, but like in Russia, this doesn't happen. Or like, oh, but in France, this is what happens. Like, this isn't real. And like, no, it's on Mars. Don't worry about what could or could not be real. Just think about the actual issue at hand.
Lets you set the boundaries more specifically to what you need.
Which I think is like one of the things. I have a lot of critiques about how original Star Trek handled some of the stuff that it was trying to do, because it was a very of its time show. But one of the things that people often talk about is the way that it used the concept of aliens to be able to explore racism from an external perspective, which I think is one of the things that we're talking about with this. It's like you can separate yourself from the social trappings of whatever it is you're trying to talk about. Because if you tried to write a book about racism in like the, real fantasy tradition, your realistic fantasy, it would be very complex, which is important. We should get into the real super complex weeds with that. But if you remove yourself from it, you can also get rid of all of your preconceived notions and things. And a lot of the stuff that original Star Trek was trying to do in a very ham-fisted way was have it like, look at these guys. They're racist towards each other for a stupid reason. Don't you feel stupid to be racist?
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, not to say that's the function of sci-fi, because when you talk about functions of art, that's silly. But I think that's really important.
I think it's a strength.
Yeah, strength. That's a good
I
word.
feel like the funny thing about that is it also kind of comes with a responsibility, though, in that I've seen a lot of plots try and just kind of, oh, well, what if we made this a racism allegory, and then they handle it so badly that it either falls really flat, accidentally takes a weird side, or sometimes at worst, they will write a thing where they're like, okay, well, we started going into the lore more and more about this thing that was supposed to be on its surface, just like, these guys hate these guys, and it doesn't seem very fair. And then they, write more backstory for who those guys are, and it turns out that, like, the racism is entirely justifiable within that world. And you're like, why did you write this? How did you get here?
Zootopia.
Yeah.
That's a great example of like, yeah, we have literal people who eat other people.
I do think that that's a very common, that's a really common misuse, because you're not thinking about it that way. I think that that's one of the problems that we're hitting.
Right.
Is like, since it's not, I don't think this is a very popular way of conceptualizing fiction as like a way that you should think deeply about these allegories. So some people like just throw the allegory in there and go like, haha, I'm doing something cool because it's an allegory for racism. I didn't think about how I made it like, actually these one guys do have actual dangerous superpowers, which is pretty racist in and of itself.
The magical insert race here of choice tropes,
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think that idea is really interesting. I've used the word
It's all
interesting so many times. Sorry, it's me being an academic. Me being a humanities academic, because, Isaacs is a science academic. But this idea of... I was talking to James Mendez-Hodes, who's a very prominent thinker in the game space about diversity and equity and representation and things like that. He does a lot of consulting for companies and stuff. And he was talking about how, like, the idea that orcs become a racist stand-in for black people and people from Africa. And he says how it's hard to escape that, because if those were the origins of orcs, right, they're this like racist kind of coded stand-in, because Tolkien-esque fantasy was so popular and so emulated that other writers down the decades write about orcs and things, and while they're like, no, this is not racist, this is just a fantasy genre staple, right? But the problem is those fantasy genre staples come from racist stuff, right? And so modern authors might not want to spread those ideas, but where does it come from, right? Terry Pratchett has a great speech called Why Gandalf Never Married. He talks about this idea of the consensus fantasy universe, where a lot of fantasy relies on this consensus fantasy. We all kind of, in the West, know sort of what an elf is or what a dwarf is or have some conception. And when books deviate from that, they do so knowing that they're deviating because you have a preconception of what it actually is, right? And so because of this consensus fantasy universe, we forget the origins and ideas that those fantasy tropes were meant to, even if they weren't meant to, what they did emulate and bring about, such as, a racism about orcs, right? And I think that's an interesting issue to grapple with as someone who writes in a space with this consensus shared universe ideas of what these images mean.
There was this really interesting interview I heard ages ago from the writer of Lovecraft Country, which, is H.P. Lovecraft stuff in the American South. And he said that Lovecraft stuff is so fundamental to the genre of horror that it's in there. It's no matter what you do, it's there. So the fact that this racist nonsense is so fundamental to the horror genre, you can either write something in horror and ignore it, in which case you're just unthinkingly repeating the same ideas, or you can write something in horror and intentionally examine the things that you're repeating so that you can actually break them down and look at them and use them.
And I think what's really important there, and this is what I try and tell students this, is that art, if you think of a work of art as disembodied from any social, historic, political thing, which is impossible, the aesthetics, the artistic choices an art is used are not necessarily inherently racist or colonial or sexist or homophobic or whatever, but they become so because of social and historic context, right? We were talking about earlier, and the Adam Roberts talked about, right? And so I think that's really important. If you're like, no, you can say, yes, an orc is not a racist thing. It is an orc. It is a fantasy creature. But orcs came about because we live in a world which has this, because this one writer had this conception and all that. And thus, when we recreate that, exactly what you're saying, Gap, when it's important to be like, what is the historic and social context that this comes from, because it is impossible to divorce ourselves from it. And if we think we divorce ourselves from it, usually when we think we've made, this is big in the game space, right? I have made it an apolitical game. My game is not political at all, right? Right? Usually when you think you did that, it is because the politics you are referencing are things you take for granted, right? I was talking to my undergrads about this, and I'm like, Tetris. What is the politics of Tetris? And they're like, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, well, what does it take for granted? For example, Tetris takes for the fact that you can see for granted, right? It's not the best example of a deep politics critique that it's trying to make, but it does take for granted this thing, right? This political thing. Not everyone can see. And it's actually a big issue that a lot of the world is made for people who can see, and the people who can't see have a harder time with things, right? So
if we bring it back round, then, I think that the idea of this, I'm sorry, what did you call it?
Social and historic context?
No, not that bit, which is very important. But the community consensus, the sort of social consensus.
Terry Pratchett called it the consensus fantasy universe.
So, would we say that one of the things that we get from science fiction is that so much of our modern ideas are built around technology and sciencism? Then has that become our new consensus? Even if we don't know how a computer works, we'll have a consensus idea of what a computer is supposed to do.
I like that, but it's also a time capsule in a way. Again, as Hoots was sort of bringing up with the idea of our ideas of the future, we keep time stamping these with this is the future of the 1960s. This is the future according to the 1980s. And I think there is a general sense that all these technologies exist in like a kind of uniform way for the people who are contemporary with the fiction, but like in the past looking to it, like when we think it's silly, when we're like, they for some reason for them it's really advanced that they have video calls, like that would be a thing that we would probably think of as really trivial now, but back then was like mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm going to bring up just a thing to tie the two back in. Then, are robots racist?
I think it's interesting, right? Because going back to Star Wars, one of the Star Wars films, at least, tries to grapple with the idea of can we exploit robots for their labor?
Really
right?
badly.
Mm-hmm.
Was it Rogue One?
it
I
was
think that does that,
Solo,
or
I think.
Han
It was
Solo.
Rogue. I think it was.
It was Solo.
Oh, it was Solo. It was Han Solo. Yeah. Not Rogue One.
That was so grating because they don't want to actually engage with heavy questions, so they just sort of threw in an aesthetic gesture towards the idea of robot liberation.
Yes,
and like,
right.
They turned her into
and it became
Hermione.
like a cringe culture war thing.
Yeah, they literally.
They're like,
did-
isn't it annoying when they ask for rights?
That's actually a great point. That's a great observation, Hoot. They turned her into Hermione. Oh no. So I think robots can often be a stand-in for many different things in many different media. And this is where I think I like what you were asking about. Does consensus fantasy, or do we have a new consensus fantasy world, but for sci-fi? Because Pratchett said that we don't really have for sci-fi at that time, right? Because, Pratchett has passed away. But does it affect the new world? I would say I would lean towards no, because as our technology changes so rapidly, our conception of sci-fi changes. Just like that's why we have these time capsules that you brought up, Rosencreutz, right? 70s sci-fi, 80s sci-fi, 50s sci-fi. While fantasy, while we keep making social progress, the shape of the fantasy world is often, at least in the West, is often still this medieval Western mishmash of Dark Ages and Renaissance, kind of, right? And the only thing that changes is now gay people are fine in it, and and now they're not, right? Or now we have trans people, like.
So I think that's what made me think of it, though, because like, is our sci-fi ideas about technology actually evolving as technology evolves, or is the aesthetic of them evolving as technology evolves? Because one of the things that I was thinking of, the reason that I brought up robots in the first place is because of the cultural historical context with robots. While they were done a long, long time ago, like the word robot from the
Forced
Rossum's
labor.
Universal Robots play, our modern conception is almost entirely Asimov. He was like the seminal robot guy. One of the things that people comment on that's very unexplored in Asimov's writing is the way that he uses them to comment on racism constantly in a very like just day-to-day way, because they're not sentient. Asimov's robots are not sentient. He goes well out of his way to explain how they work, how they're just rules, they're just programming, they are not really sentient beings as we understand them. But the most common affectation that people use towards the robots is boy.
Whoops.
And he does that intentionally because they're just the new underclass in a very uncommented on way in the world. And I think that's kind of gotten into a lot of the things since then, because, he was the robot guy. When you even think about like Star Trek, like he invented the word positronic that you see all over in robot stuff now.
Does anyone have an example of media that thinks of, conceives of, or treats robots differently? I'm thinking maybe Murderbot, but I haven't actually read them. I've only read about them, and I really want to get to reading them, because that's told from the point of view of one of these robots, right?
Does robots count?
Yeah, robots is interesting, but because that's like what the Flintstones did for cavemen, robots did for robots.
I don't know. I've just been, since you brought it up, I've just been thinking about because robots are usually depicted as a servant class in our sci-fi, and the first thing that occurred to me is that they're also like intentionally or not like a kind of sexist trope. We have like Rosie from the Jetsons, even like the kind of default voices that we get for our assistants in the real world, like for Siri and Alexa, the default voices are women, and I do think that is that comes from, because like our technology has been in conversation with sci-fi for decades now, right? Like a lot of things, a lot of like the people working for tech companies have said that they were inspired by like Star Trek and stuff. And I do think that our technological assistants in the real world are often women because the people who designed them were growing up with sci-fi servants who were women.
Or just secretaries.
Oh, like the computers, like Hidden Figures,
Yeah.
that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is kind of getting to what I was trying to complicate a little bit with these definitions, because robots have always been a representation of the working underclass, be that from slavery or from the free exploitation of women's
Servant
labor
class.
or labor that we see as inherently feminine. So, but overall, like you were saying, Sharang, has the stuff that robots can do, have robots since their original identification in Rossum as like the worker uprising fear, has that really changed in sci-fi as our technology has evolved, or have the robots simply gotten, more streamlined and less clunky? Like, is the robots from older sci-fi that want to kill you because of their like AI uprising, but it's a guy in a big tin can suit, is that fundamentally different than your sleek modern Terminator that can run around because it's like, AI generated whatever? Like fundamentally, I'd say those are the same thing. We've aesthetically updated the technology so that it looks futuristic.
The same fear
from our
and guilt
perspective.
we're commenting on. Yeah.
Yeah, we're commenting on the same thing. We haven't really changed what a robot is. We've changed what a robot looks like.
And we've expanded the duties that a robot can have. I think about this a lot when it comes to the idea of like robots originally were supposed to be like, kind of the same as like a factory mechanism that's just supposed to put a thing together. Like at its base level, it's supposed to do a menial task of some kind, something that like a human would waste their time doing. But then a lot of the conceptions of what robots are is that they start to take on like social roles. And you see this with like, weird AI tech bro nerds trying to be like, we're going to make the first AI bartender. Why would you want that? Robots is another big thing for like, can you sexually exploit a robot sex worker? And like that's like a thing that just keeps coming up as like a weird background thing where like they either have fully made that part of their world and not even touched it in the slightest, and you get to go, that's a little bit uncomfortable, or it's actually like talked about and like sort of picked apart. But that is a very much a different kind of role, even though it does, happen to fit into the sort of like sexist framing of robot or like owning this thing that is a person but is not a person. But it's so dependent on the fact that the robot is closer to a person than before. And I think earlier conceptions didn't really try and make that leap as clearly. That wasn't the goal for the robot.
I think that is it closer to a person than before is the key, because like you were saying, we don't feel bad about the kind of robot that's just a mechanical arm in a factory putting things together. We don't feel that you're sexually exploiting a vibrator, right? But once in fiction or whatever, once they start to look more human, and once you start putting the fictional traits that they act social, that they might sound human, they act social, they might have social roles, then we start being like, oh, this has now become... If I wrote a story where it's all about like robot, like electronic vibrators, people are like, great, electronic vibrators, whatever. But if I wrote a story about people-shaped robots that we're having sex with, that immediately brings to mind in the reader, oh, this person is asking questions about exploiting labor because these things are now shaped like people, right? Similarly, if I wrote a story about a mechanical arm, whatever, but if I wrote about a mechanical person, then they're like, this now becomes about questions of human labor. So I think we talk about all vibes, all aesthetics, but the vibes and aesthetics are key to what we take away from the story as themes in some of these cases. I think.
Right.
And I would also, maybe argue that at some point, as we get more robots in our general day-to-day world, we might run into a problem where that the how we are interact with robots in the real world complicates this very divide on the aesthetics too, and it'll sort of force a new evolution potentially. Or it might actually just reinforce the ones we currently have. So it's something to be sort of thinking about as we go forward.
I'd say it's also somewhat to the point that as robots in our stories have evolved, they've taken on more and more roles that sort of just mirror whatever our social idea of undervalued labor is. Like sex work has always been undervalued labor. Some of that comes in more now because we have gotten to a social point where you can write about it more. But like the modern stuff, I think we're going to get more sci-fi stories soon about the robot artist and things. The more that like our generative AI ideals, where they go like, isn't art really stupid, undervalued labor that no one wants to do?
I like my artist friends. I want to give them hugs. Sorry.
Podcasting robots.
Because you're taking the promise of automation and then mixing it with the fear of the oppressed underclass thing. But even in the original, like Rossum, the robots weren't mechanical. They were some kind of undisclosed, unexplained biomechanical engineering things. Like they were
robots.
Meat somethings.
One of my favorite sci-fi pieces of media is the video game Citizen Sleeper by Jump Over the Edge by Gareth Damian Martin. And I assigned it in my class. I've been doing it since it came out, came out 3 years ago. And in it, you play this world is you can like sell yourself to these corporations to pay off debt or whatever, and they take your consciousness and implant it into robot bodies that slowly degrade over time. And somewhere out there, maybe we don't even really know, your actual body is lying asleep because you're paying off your time or whatever through labor. And it really does ask the question of what is the self. I think one of us mentioned that as like a main thing that sci-fi likes to ask. And that is that complicates and complexifies what is a robot, because the body is robotic, but the mind technically belongs to a human that got implanted into there through hand-wavy technology, right? And that I would highly recommend this game. It's not that long, and it does make you think about like robot and the self, and because the whole game is about making. One of my undergrads argues, and I used to have to write papers, and I got bored of grading undergrad terrible papers, and I make them make TikTok style videos about it now, to teach them new media skills. But one of them talked about how the game is all intensely about the social relationships you make. Like you meet all these NPCs and do mini quests and stuff for them. And is that what it means to be human? The social web that we form. And I think that's an interesting conception of like robot, not robot. What makes us a human?
This also,
Right.
It in some ways does get back to that, to the Frank Herbert definition of science fiction as the only genre that tries to explore what it means to be human. Which I don't know if it's the only genre, but as a general thing,
Yeah,
I think it's
all
nice.
of these statements we've all brought up from different authors and scholars and critics and stuff are like broadly applicable, but not always, right? Because art is all about finding new weird things.
There's some
right?
softness going on here, despite heart sci-fi trying to be a thing.
Right? Like a book can both be sci-fi fantasy and also British
genres.
literary fiction, depending on the bookstore and how snooty they want to be.
Genres hit a limit of usefulness in the sense that, like, I mean, my God, look at like metal. Metal is a nightmare web that I would never wish upon anyone to like actually dig into. But sometimes you hit a point where you find,
Like, you mean the music genre?
yes, metal as a music genre has like so many subgenre and subgenre like taxonomy. There's so much like classification and taxonomy going on that it becomes literally useless at a point. You'll be like, oh yeah, well that's like more like melodic something death metal, and you're like, right, you're describing two bands. You can just tell me that you like this band and you like that band, and we're done. And sometimes I feel like that kind of creeps back into when we have even still very broad genres like sci-fi. Like the genre shorthand, we are assuming that the person we're talking to will read from the shorthand the thing we're writing. So if I say that, like, oh, Le Guin writes sci-fi, you might be like, oh, cool, robots, space. Might not necessarily be what I'm talking about,
Right.
And if the person doesn't know who Le Guin is as a writer,
Right.
introducing someone to that idea with the genre might be helpful. But then other times people might say, oh, I really like sci-fi. And you're like, great, you might like Le Guin. And then they go, I tried her and I didn't like her at all. You go, but it was sci-fi. So, at that point, it kind of loses we're assuming there's a communicable value to genre, and it is there, but it also fails a lot. And I think in that failure, we kind of just have to accept that that's why there's so many definitions we can come up with.
So I'm gonna say, and yet there is something visceral about genre. At least I feel like I'm you know, I am a professor of media. I like have to think about these things, but at the same time, I'm like, oh, but I will like this game more if it's fantasy than if it's sci-fi, right? This is a thing I feel. Oh, I will pick up. I'm more likely to pick up a book if it's fantasy than like hard sci-fi, right? Even though I have enjoyed hard sci-fi, I have very much so. I haven't blah blah. But there's this emotional reaction to, oh no, but the vibes, the trappings, like I want it. Right, like I think it's inescapable in some sense, right?
Which is something that I've been thinking about, and I've seen some other people mention, are things like sci-fi and fantasy and some of these like really broader, you know, genres, settings, and not genres.
So we're talking about Pratchett's consensus fantasy universe as a sort of setting.
Yeah, because it's more of a set. I mean, would you say that? Let's see, what's my favorite Discworld book? Would you say The Thief of Time is the same genre as Lord of the Rings?
Right, exactly. They're extremely different. Right. I mean, even within the Discworld, the books can be in a slightly different genre in some sense, right? Because some of them are more detective fiction and some of them are more like hero fiction, right?
But the Discworld setting in and of itself is very, what if the consensus world of fantasy, then what?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, how would a city guard function in the consensus world of fantasy, and what can I do with
In some
that?
ways, it's similar to Futurama. All these sci-fi tropes just kind of keep showing up in various ways, and it's all really played for as a laugh, but it's also a world where all of these things that pop up in all sorts of random science fiction that are part of the consensus of science fiction all are true here at all times.
Well, I was going to say that kind of gets me to a thing, because we need to start wrapping up a little bit. So I wanted to sort of end off on, I asked everyone to at least think of a couple of examples of like their archetypal and their hear me outs. And I have just sort of a list. So we're going to go through, and I want everyone to do a bit of a free-form lightning round. We're going to name things that are possible weird edge cases or even main staples. Everyone is going to go down and say sci-fi or not, and give me one sentence as to why. So I'll start with that because that was on my list. Futurama. I would say yes, sci-fi, because it's probably one of the shows that tries to explore sci-fi tropes and critiques the most out of anything I've ever seen.
I agree. I agree. Sci-fi.
I'll also agree, though there are times it does bend what even sci-fi means, but yes.
I'd say it's sci-fi. It's like it's not an sci-fi, like necessarily trying to collect all those things to be like, this is what the true thing is, but it is just relying on all those things so much that like you see sci-fi reflected in it at the very least.
I'm gonna say sci-fi because an average viewer would look at it and the vibes and aesthetics they get is it is sci-fi. There's a robot in there, kind of thing, you know.
Right. Does anybody else have one?
Or hear me out. Okay, mine is wild. The song "Call Me Maybe" by Carly Rae Jepsen is sci-fi because she sings, "Before you came into my life, I missed you so bad," implying time travel or parallel universes.
I love that. I never thought of a sci-fi reading of that. I always took the poetic reading of that, right? Which is like, I missed the concept of you, and then you came up to me, and then now you're gay.
I know. I like it, and everyone should watch the music video for that.
Yeah.
So I'd say yes with that reading, because the music video also really leans into that same kind of stalker vibe.
I'm going to go with no, because deja vu is a thing that people feel that they have experienced something that they've only just now experienced. So it's all an illusion of the mind.
Okay.
But what if deja vu was aliens?
Yeah.
But what about ghosts?
It could be fantasy too. It could be a past life.
I'm just going to give the tentative no of like, I think that's a very funny idea, but I do think it's intended more as like a not knowing what you were missing thing, like a void in your life before you got there kind of thing. But I still think it's a very funny idea that this is like a time loop situation.
It is a fun idea. I'll give you that.
Okay, I'll give one. I posit that Dracula can be viewed as sci-fi because in Dracula, the novel goes into a lot of it focuses a lot on like the technologies they're using to solve the mysteries, the technology that exists at that time. And you can also argue that at that time, the I think spiritualist movement and stuff had kind of happened, and a lot of people were considering spiritualism and stuff as, oh, it's just a thing some people can do, and we can study it, and they did study it, right? Just like some people can sing at a note that most people can't, or some people might be able to hear the frequencies of the dog whistle, right? So you could say like because of that oh yeah, spiritualism stuff was just considered whatever, and all the technological stuff for that time period, you could view it as a work of sci-fi.
Ooh, yeah, I can definitely see that. I still think of it aesthetically as like a drama and a mystery. I like that interpretation.
Yeah, I'll back that up. It's science fiction with just so much Z-rust on it that's built up over, years and decades and centuries now, that we can't tell that it's not science fiction unless we do a deep dive like this.
Yeah, I agree with that one. I wouldn't have thought of it, but when you explain it, I don't really see it as that much different than 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, saying you can run an entire submarine off of special batteries.
I'm like actively restraining myself from slamming the table because I wrote like a 5-paragraph tangent about this exact idea in a script for a video I did about vampire games, because it ultimately did not connect at all, but just the very way that they talk about all these things, and they say like, okay, we know that there are rules for vampires, and then Van Helsing's like a university professor, and he's like, well, rule 1 for vampires is this, everyone knows that, and it's like a whole like 5-paragraph info dump about vampire rules. They have it down to a science, so I'm going to say yes.
Yeah.
I can't explain it, but there's also something that seems, again, aesthetically very sci-fi about like epistolary novels. Like people writing letters back and forth just feels so grounded.
I love this exercise, by the way, Gepwin, because it's on the surface, the exercise is us being like, yes, it's sci-fi, no doubt. But in actuality, it's about the permeability of definitions and the boundaries and the weirdness that comes from classifying. So that's a great exercise.
Also, everything is sci-fi.
Also, another piece of evidence that Dracula is sci-fi is that in Dr. McNinja, Dracula has a moon base.
Yeah.
Oh, well, there you go.
I taught a class, I taught a graduate seminar last spring called The Course of Strahd. Which is all about studying. We played Curse of Strahd and studied it, but we were looking at vampires in games, and I made them read Dracula as a starting thing, as a foundational thing.
I have a twofer that I was going to bring up, but it didn't fit. I think the first one everyone's going to say yes. So cyberpunk as a genre, sci-fi, yeah. Okay. What about Shadowrun, which is cyberpunk with elves?
I thought you were going to say steampunk, and I was going to say hard no.
Yes.
Shadowrun. Ooh. They get transformed into that in like a snap kind of moment, right? Like the whole world just kind of shifts once magic gets like plopped into everything, right? Yeah.
Yes. Right.
I feel like the answer is no, but it has steampunk in it. I mean, cyberpunk in it, in the same way that like it's not even like a genre blending. It's like there's just both things happening.
Sometimes they compete in weird ways. Yeah, I'm having a hard one thinking about this one because I am fairly familiar with Shadowrun. And I've thought about, is it really sci-fi? Is it fantasy? Is it both? Is it neither? And it's almost kind of its own thing.
I do not know this game, but based on the cover image alone, I'm going with my aesthetic definition. Yeah, sure. It looks like sci-fi, therefore it is.
Yeah, I think it's a blend. I think it is both simultaneously because it does. I mean, all the games that deal with consequences of magic and consequence of technology, so I think it's dealing with like both kinds of things.
A funny jumping off point would be, this wasn't my example, but is one I did think about, was Arcana Obscura, which of Steamworks and Magica, which is specifically about the tension between like a fantasy world where like the Industrial Revolution is happening and magic and industry do not play well together. I think that one would be definitely sci-fi.
I mean, Arcanum is weird because in Arcanum, magic breaks down technology and technology breaks down magic, right? Like the world is that if you magic is about breaking physics and technology is about solidifying physics. So if you are on a train, it is harder for you to do magic because you're in an environment that's leveraging physics or whatever, right? Yeah. That's an interesting one.
I have one like small deranged one, which I actually planned to come here with, which is Howl's Moving Castle. In that it's entirely predicated on technology, but 0% what any of you would think of if someone said sci-fi, right? Pretty much all of me, or not all of, but like...
Yeah, it is something I primarily think of as fantasy, but it's in that like kind of steampunky area where it's a little bit fantasy, a little bit historical fiction, a little bit sci-fi, like
future.
I think it definitely counts.
I feel the steampunk thing is much more in the movie than in the book, though, right? Like the book is not as much steampunky.
Oh, I haven't actually read the book.
So for the movie, which I would say yes.
I was going to lean toward no because his entire steampunk thing is run by a demon. But then I was like, but I don't think all of the airplanes and stuff are that he's fighting.
Right.
Yeah, so the book isn't because there's no steampunk and airplanes in the book. However, the book is set in an alternate world and Earth is one of the... Like they go to Wales at one point in the book.
Fantasy. There we go.
Right? Because Howell is actually from Wales. His real name is Howell. His name is Howell Jenkins. And so while the movie has steampunky things complicating it, the book has whales complicating it.
I got a few things to maybe offer up. The X-Files seems rather sci-fi, but I'd actually argue it's not. I'm curious what everyone else has to say, though.
Really? Even though there's like aliens?
I guess my general argument is that it's... there's some trappings of science fiction, but it's all in a certain sort of approach that is in a conspiracy, unknown, otherworldly sort of forces factoring in here that are driving these external narratives while our heroes have no access to any of that, other than occasionally we encounter MacGuffin that does a thing, but we don't understand it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the air of mystery does that winged dog thing where it's like, we don't really care about how those things work. Like, oh, aliens, it's a mysterious external force, right? I think that's, Yeah,
I'd also think I'd say no, because also the whole secrecy thing fundamentally gets rid of, like, how does this affect the world in any meaningful way? It's how does this affect the FBI?
Yeah.
Right.
And who cares about that?
Based on the episode that like traumatized me as a kid, where that guy was full of bees, like that doesn't get explained. And like, so if we're going by the rule that you need to like have an explanation, then no. But like, it does have the aesthetic trappings of like some sci-fi things, but then just some like unexplainable things that are vaguely rooted in biology. When they talk about it, they'll be like, oh, this stuff just happens sometimes. Like, so kind of yes there, but mostly no.
Yeah, I don't know that I go by the rule that everything has to be explained. I think it's because I still consider Star Wars a sci-fi piece. So I'm gonna still say yes because it has the aesthetics of sci-fi.
Very well. I got a couple more if you want me to toss one in.
All right, give us the one or two.
The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. Is anyone actually familiar with this one at all?
I've played it once.
I had to read an entire synopsis of this Unhinged thing.
So the short version is it's a satirical adventure of the titular character there going about getting up to misbehaviors. But the particular aspect I want to draw a circle around is his adventures going to the moon, where he meets the moon people there who have detachable heads.
Oh.
And and when your head is separate from your body, it can have a different personality entirely versus when it's fully attached. And as a result, we have a science fiction setting with a one quirky concept at play that can draw attention to the behaviors of people and commentate specifically on the dual nature of monarchs in particular, because in the film at least, the King of the Moon, when he's just a floating head, is intellectual maybe a little office, unhinged and inventing things like spring after the fact. But when he's attached to his body, it's all about those instincts and making use of his abilities and power and influence to really enjoy his pleasures and things like that. And so it's commenting on the detached but enlightened version of a ideal monarch versus how they kind of are in reality.
I vote yes based on the pitch.
I would say no, but it's unfortunately because of a kind of complicated thing that we didn't have time to talk about. So I have to give like a really, really quick, like really super long run-on sentence as per my rules that this fits into a earlier literary genre that was more social commentary fiction using fantastical elements like Gulliver's Travels, which is a direct precursor and inspiration to modern science fiction, but was leaning way more into fantastical allegory that doesn't even try to make even a little bit of fundamental sense, instead of getting into like commenting on it through stuff that's even a tiny bit more grounded. Because like Gulliver's Travels is like, the same thing as the moon, but just a bunch of islands with like weird political stuff going on to make fun of various social issues of the time period.
I feel like Candide is in the same
I would
space.
I would
love
not
Candide.
call it sci-fi because it lacks I
like a
think
very
any
made-up
of the trappings
world.
and aesthetics of it. Even though the moon is also mythological. The moon's also fantasy. The moon's also horror. The moon's also romance, right? Romance. Like we didn't even talk about
The moon's also
new
fantasy.
genres.
Yeah. The moon is everything.
Final one that I was just going to say. Any Marvel movie. Just the whole thing at all.
Fantasy.
I'd say
The Marvel movie has wizards and witches as well as they try and be like, you're a mutant and I'm a wizard and
It's
we
all
both do
of
different
it.
things. Yeah, it's all of it.
It's all of it.
It's everything.
It has it's fantasy and sci-fi.
it's like Shadowrun.
And horror.
And everything,
yeah.
yeah.
It is everything.
And in some ways,
it's a big
some of them
playground.
and I think unfortunately some of those movies then become nothing.
A
Right.
little bit, yeah.
All right. So I knew we weren't going to get to an actual definition, but this has been a lot of fun. Thank you. I'm going to have everybody do their final outros and anything that you want to shill in the reverse order. So I think in the original order, Rosencreutz was last. So please, where can we find you? What do you want to sell?
Hi, I'm on youtube.com and I make videos there. And I guess I also have a Blue Sky account, but that's not as important to me because I don't make money out of it. Please visit my YouTube account and watch my YouTube videos. They're pretty okay.
Sharang.
I'm Sharang Biswas. I'm a game designer, writer, and interactive artist. My Blue Sky is probably where I put a lot of updates, so I might start a newsletter soon. Someone told me I should do that. We'll see. I have an itch page at astralingus.itch.io. I have some of my small games there. And my new book is coming out in March from Neon Hemlock Press. It's called The Iron Below Remembers. I mentioned it earlier today. It's weird fantasy sci-fi Indians with giant robots, superheroes, and it's extremely gay. And two of my reviewers have called it, quote, very horny, end quote. Check it out. I think it's quite good. It's my first book. I'm very proud of it.
Excellent.
Hi. And Hoots.
Hey, I'm Hoots. I also have a YouTube channel. You can find me at Hoots YouTube, where I put my body through really painful challenges in order as like a jumping off point to discuss things like second wave feminism, etc.
That was a good one.
Thank you. My podcast is called Respect the Dead. It's a bi-weekly comedy history podcast where myself and YouTuber Kaylin Conrad talk about a person, place, or thing that is dead, usually in a way that is disrespectful. It's also very gay and mean. And you can find me on Blue Sky at Hoots, and you can find me on Twitter at Punished Hoots.
Which is apt for Twitter these days.
Yeah, I've been banned before.
And everybody probably knows us. If you don't, you can go listen to our other things, which are not at all like this ever. And thanks to everybody who's stuck around and listening for letting us do 200 episodes of this unhinged thing. Oh,
And thank you for inviting
We
us.
love you.
it's been real fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This is
Thanks
great.
everybody for coming.
Thanks for coming.
And next week, I forget what we're doing, and I'm not going to look it up because people have to go. So we'll find out.
Thank you guys. That was a really good conversation. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Yeah, that was awesome.
Next time on Watchers of Tomorrow, the nudity transporter. You have been listening to Watchers of Tomorrow, a podcast on science fiction media. Find and listen to Watchers of Tomorrow on Podbean, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Digital Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Google Play, and many more places where podcasts can be found. If you enjoyed our podcast, make sure to subscribe for more. And make sure to rate your experience or leave us a review. You may find Gepwin on YouTube as Gepwin and on Pillow Fort. You may find I, Dr. Isix, on YouTube and Blue Sky. Music is Waveform and Mori's Principle, both by DRKRN, and Quirky Dog by Kevin MacLeod. Check out the Watchers of Tomorrow Discord channel. You may also find Watchers of Tomorrow on Tumblr. Make sure to share the experience of Watchers of Tomorrow with your friends, loved ones, enemies, alien overlords, and your doppelganger from the mirror dimension. Have a good day, and ahead, warp factor heckin' fast.